I remember my first live DAWless show and stepping out onto that stage and setting everything up and can't waiting to hear all those sounds I worked so much on, and it just didn't fly. And I didn't quite understand what was going on until eventually I learned that there are a few key principles. I'm going to cover 3 today of sound design for DAWless performance, especially when you're live on stage. So I'm going to talk about these 3 skills today. I wish I knew about them before I stepped on stage. See you on the other side. Hi, I'm DAWless. So what are these 3 skills? Well, first, you need to think about sound design as mixing. Every sound that you design, you need to think about where it fits in the frequency spectrum. Number 2, you need to think about patches as instruments. You're not just creating one patch, one sound. You're creating a playable patch, which is like an instrument that has a whole range. And number 3, saturation. The secret that everybody knows, yet nobody uses. Hang around and I'll see you on the other side. Alright, here we are. 3 sound design tricks, I would say principles, that you really need for DAWless sound design. And of course they tie into performance, which is what makes this unique. So, number 1, frequency layering. Really the principle here is that you need to mix while you're designing your sounds. So every sound really is already meant for certain place in a frequency spectrum. Now, that may not be the case when you're using a DAW, because you can put a bunch of stuff in there and then cut and shape as much as you want. But in DAWless sound design, you really want to mix while you're designing the sound. So let's hear this little synth patch. So there's a few chords for this kind of deep house track that we're going to use today to demonstrate these things. So this, when you hear it, may sound kind of weak, maybe tinny, doesn't really have lots of bass, doesn't have lots of low end. So maybe we're tempted to add more low end here, okay, a little bit more girth. Maybe open the filter a little bit, or maybe not open the filter, but just envelope generation. Okay, so now this sounds bigger, but actually it's worse. Now, why do I say that? Well, let's hear it together with this drum groove. So, it may not be obvious, but actually the low end of this sound is now covering up the kick and the lower end of the clap a little bit, and the higher parts, which are there because we open up the filter, are covering up the pizzazz of the higher part of the drums. So let's try to put this back and you'll see what I mean. Now we're kind of where we were before, and let's see what happens when we listen to it with the drums now. Now notice that the hi-hat's going to be heard better, the kick hits harder, and we actually have the expressiveness that we can use. But that's going to have to wait till number 2. Okay, so that's one example of how we can basically built-in mix him in a sound design. I really wanted this to sit somewhere in the mid-range of the frequency spectrum, and that's how the sound was created here. A similar thing is with drums, so let's maybe just listen to these drums. So really the most of the low energy here, it's done by the kick drum here. These hats are not too high, they're kind of pretty broad. They take lots of area upstairs. This is about in a similar spot. Okay, notice that already kind of fills that high mid area. So there was kind of a problem when we were opening the filter too much here. Those two would be conflicting. So here we have a high element and a low element playing against each other. The other thing you're going to notice that they're panned pretty hard left and right, and that's so they can stay out of the way of, for example, these hats, which are pretty close. They're also panned a little bit away from each other, and the kick, which is in the center, and the claps and snares are also panned a little bit away from each other. So here we're also, when we were designing these sounds, trying to kind of think about the mixing aspect, because, for example, we want the high energy to be balanced left and right, as well as we want the low energy balanced left and right. So as a result, I have the claps and the snares, which are somewhat in a similar part of the frequency spectrum, panned against each other, and closed and open hi-hats panned against each other, so we don't cram that center with a high frequency, which is going to be taken by some of this stuff here. Okay, let's get to the bass. So for the bass here, we're using the West Pest. So here's a little bass line that I program in here. Now, key thing here is sequencing relative to this kick drum. So you'll notice that the lowest note of the bass line is not falling the same time where the kick is, that is on the 1 over the first bar. Rather, it's on the 16th note after. That creates a syncopation and a call and response shape that kind of drives the groove forward, but it also solves the problem of this competing together with the kick drum. So let's see if I can put this so now the lowest note is playing at the same time as the kick, and now we have this huge accent. The cadence of the groove completely changes and it drowns out the kick, and now the kick has a very lopsided feel. Compare that to this. Now we can really feel that pulse despite this being syncopated quite a bit. So we're always thinking about frequency and not just how they are distributed horizontally in a given moment, but also in time. It's okay to have lots of stuff layered in one instrument if not much else is playing. So if we're doing the breakdown, for example, now we are maybe overcrowding the high end, but we are creating some energy. So that's kind of maybe even okay temporarily. And of course we added these claps and snares as soon as we take this out, so we don't lose too much energy. Okay. So I hope this helps you see how you can basically think about mixing while you're doing the sound design, and why it's important to incorporate these ideas of where instruments are going to sit in a frequency spectrum while you're designing your sound, and while you are thinking about how they will fit with other instruments in your arrangement. All right, number 2, playable patches and or sequences. That's a must for DAWless live performance and sound design, because really you're not designing one perfect patch that's going to sit exactly somewhere in the mix and never change. You want a playable patch, one that can afford you lots of expressiveness, and where with few twists or 1 or 2 knobs can get a lighter mileage. So it's really, I really think of each patch as an instrument that can be played, that actually can give a wide variety of sound expression. So let's look at this synth patch here. So right now I have it on low where it functions more, let's kill these drums, functions more as a percussive element. That's because the filter is set low and filter envelope generation is just high enough so you can hear it. There's also some delay, that is no delay. We can have it really clean like this. But we can add a little more movement. And we stereoize this sound. So this is where I like to park this for this particular track, right? It'll add the percussive element, it'll drive the groove. Already with this, we have these two playing against each other. But you will also notice that we have somewhere to go with this. So I can open up the filter here. Because the filter is pretty low and this is fairly high, we'll actually get a lots of additional high frequency content even with not opening the filter too much. If we want to fill more of the space, we can use the release. I'm introducing a little bit of delay with the high filter sweeps here. Well, we're in this down, right? So okay, so that's one playability part. This synth is pretty cool because it's very, very playable. Let's hear this. So we have this on a sawtooth wave with very little wave folding so that we have a pretty strong bass component, which is the role it's playing here. So, however, we can also fold this wave. Now we get much more high frequency content, but we lose some bass. But for example, we'll regain some bass around here, at least on this wave folder. So here's about where the bass is regained. Not much bass here. Quite a lot of bass here. Yeah, and the most bass here. So this is really already a mixing knob in terms of frequency for this bass element. So you can see how the first principle of mixing while designing sound really plays into this playability. Because if you know where the sweet spots are, you can really use it to your advantage. So if we do a build-up, we introduce a little more high frequency content here, a little delay. But at the end, when I go back, I still want to have some bass. So let's find this sweet spot here, so the bass will stay a bit more prominent in the mix, but will retain that low end bite. Somewhere here. Okay, so I hope you see how if you know the sweet spot, right, and if you think about a whole range of sound you can achieve with the given patch, that it really gives you lots of playability options. And number 3, this is kind of a weird one, and it has to do with processing, right? So one thing in DAWless is like you're not going to have probably endless compressors. You're not going to have as many effects or everything going through bus distortions and what have you. But there's one thing you should consider, which I would say is number 1 if you're designing sound and performing in a DAWless realm, and that is distortion or saturation, for several reasons. And it's really important at every stage of making your sounds and performing. So let's look at this patch. So in this case, we can drive the filter of this patch. Now, I did not decide to do that here because the patch was already doing what it was supposed to do within the context of a mix. But in a different context, I would consider increasing the drive. Let's hear how that sounds. It already sounds more aggressive, right? It pops in a mix more, and it's louder, of course, overall, in terms of RSM. I think it was fine here, especially because I was trying to go for a little more of a chill sound. There's really no distortion on this unit that can be applied, although you can certainly enrich this sound the old school way to make it more dirty. So what's the old school way? Well, let's look at that. So we're gonna increase the signal as much as we can coming in here. It doesn't gonna distort because this is not that powerful, but we have the gain knobs. Okay, let's do. Opa, sorry, here. Okay, and now we're basically pushing, adding some color. We're overdriving the signal coming in. That's going to flatten it a little bit, add a little more middle and mid-high frequency content, and we can reduce the volume coming out of the channel into the master. This can be a little tricky. Often you have to go really low here if you want to retain that, okay? So that's one way you can apply saturation when there's none available. That's the old school way, which is boost the preamp going into the mixer. And distortion actually is a form of compression because it does reduce the dynamic range of the strongest and lowest element. And generally you'll see that it kind of brings the percussion, the hi-hats forward and moves the energy of the bass a little higher in the frequency spectrum. Consider saturation and distortion. Where can you use it in your setup? Can you overdrive the filters? Do you maybe have to rely on the last point in a mixer? What options do you have? I would definitely recommend something like this. And if you know this channel, you've seen this around a lot of times before. It's great to run your whole mix through to apply some saturation, even full compression that can be done. Here, you can also just do your kick and bass and consider saturation units and how it can fit into your setup. So, There we are. We covered the 3 key principles for sound design for DAWless performance. Thinking of sound design as mixing, creating playable patches that are more like an expressive instrument, and using saturation at all stages of this process. Please let us know down in the comments how you deal with DAWless sound design. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you on the other side.